150 years ago, Karl Marx published his first volume of Das Kapital. Now people are revisiting his thoughts to find solutions to the problems we face today. Will Marx's theories need to draw new ideas or theoretical frameworks to guide the development of China in the years ahead? And how are Marx's ideas on ecology relevant to today's debate on climate change? Earlier, I talked to Murdock, a professor of culture and economy at the Department of Social Sciences at Loughborough University in the UK, and an expert on Marxism. He applied Marx's analysis on ecology in the context of climate change in a speech titled "Communications and Climate Crisis: The New Rift." I started by asking him the main messages he wanted to share with his audiences.
Marx lived in the 19th century, and he was particularly concerned with what was happening as so many people poured into the new cities and what was happening with agriculture. One of his insights, very important insights, was that what was happening was there was a movement from natural forms of fertilizer to chemical fertilizers. And this is what he calls the new rift. That people's relationship to the land was being broken. It was being industrialized, it was being mediated by chemicals. Instead of using firewood or water, natural forms of power, wind power, windmills, water mills,
sure.
we used coal and then later oil.
Did he see any answers or clues to answers to this problem in his
No,
mind?
because he was very good at analysing what was in front of him. He was a little bit vague about the future. So you cannot read Marx for a kind of diagram of what the future should look like. Basically, his idea of the future society was a future of cooperation and a future of a more cooperative relationship with natural resources. So he was very sensitive to that. But unfortunately, he never elaborated his ideas very clearly on that.
Now, we are talking about a kind of a reversal of the situation, right? Now we're trying to go back from the fossil fuel, back to the natural sources of energy you were describing. How do you look at the present stage?
I think we're at a crucial moment of, it could go either way. We're going back to those forms of energy that were dominant in the pre-industrial era: wind, sun power, water, and so on. That's absolutely necessary. There's a very important scientific paper written by an American, Michael Mann, and what they did was to try to measure the temperature of just above the Earth's surface over 400 years. What it shows that up until the end of the 19th century, you have a more or less flat, it's a little bit variation, then it suddenly shoots up. It's called the hockey stick because it's got that shape. So we know that that's happened, and more recent analysis shows it's got much worse since the 1970s. We're accelerating global warming. The question is, can we stop it? And that's very debatable. Maybe we can't. Some scientists believe we can't, but we can make it much slower.
That's what governments have been trying to do, and that's why we had this very famous Paris climate change meeting, which produced this Paris Agreement. However, we're seeing positions of big countries shifting at this moment from the United States. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order to roll back Obama-era greenhouse gas emission regulations. China's position has been consistent. President Xi Jinping said in Davos that we must stick to the Paris Agreement instead of walking away from it. What do you think of big countries' role in combating climate change? And what do you think of the different positions?
I would applaud very much the Chinese position. That's absolutely the right thing to do. The big countries have a double responsibility. First of all, they are themselves big contributors to carbon emissions. But more than that, they have a leadership role. Because if they don't do anything, smaller countries will say, well, why should we bother? And that's why Trump's decision is so important, because people say, well, the United States is not going to do it. Why should we do it? And so it's a disaster, an absolute disaster.
Yeah, well, he has also been talking about bringing jobs back to the United States to reopen the coal mines and starting these jobs in the coal-powered manufacturing jobs. What do you think of that? Is it feasible, first of all, and is it wise?
No, it's not feasible. If you look at all the evidence, the coal industry has been declining for some time. There will not be very many jobs in the coal industry. Also, it's becoming more and more mechanized. So they're using machines. So it's a fantasy. The more productive thing to think about is how to have ecologically sustainable jobs. And actually the new energy systems are creating a lot of jobs. Coal mining will have to disappear. But that doesn't mean to say those people cannot have any jobs. They can have jobs in clean energy. So I think the more advanced thinking in the United States is to think about reorienting the economy, not just around clean energy to supply other sectors, but itself as a major industrial system. Solar panels, wind power, and so on.
Right now, we know that the concentration of capital has led to these giant multinational corporations, and often in the oil and gas industries. What is the impact of capitalism on climate change, and why is it so hard to switch from oil back to more natural resources?
Well, my next book is called Carbon Capitalism. Capitalism is the problem. When capitalism originated, there was a decision to use coal as the major source of power, and then later oil. Remember, the very first automobiles, the very first cars, were actually electric cars. They weren't driven by the internal combustion engine. And it was because oil was discovered in California that they decided to switch to that system, because the oil companies wanted a market for their oil. So we could have had electric cars at the beginning of the 20th century. Imagine what that difference that might have made. But what you have are these enormously powerful companies that have been there a long time, and they have incredible political influence, particularly in the United States. And so it's very difficult to shift the politics, because certainly on the Republican side of the US political spectrum, the oil industries and the coal industries have incredible amount of power. And a lot of the representatives of a lot of the Republican representatives in Senate and Congress come from regions where those are incredibly important industries. And so they feel that they must defend them. So you have a kind of political blockage. Everybody knows that the science tells us that this is not sustainable. But the science doesn't determine politics,
Science doesn't have the lobbying power. That
so
the
it doesn't have the lobbying power.
What about the digital media? We don't have the lobbying power, but we are very influential. We reach people when we are, allowed to. What is the role of digital media on climate crisis?
Well, actually, highly problematic. This is a very old. I feel ashamed to own this, but this machine. When you see the advertisements for this, you're not encouraged to ask, where does this come from? This is made up of resources that have to be mined, have to be manufactured. The machine itself has to be made in a factory. It has to be transported, probably on a container ship. And when you use it, you're using a huge amount of energy.
However, the problem really is, and people replace them even before they become defunct.
That's the other problem. That we've been encouraged to throw things away almost on every year. There's a new model.
But there's no way to stop that if you look at the reality. Is there a way? Because everybody is trying to get ahead with the latest new gadget. I mean, that is that's the problem, maybe.
It is a huge problem, but I'm old enough to remember when we didn't do that, when we had a radio and it did all the things you wanted it to do, and you kept it. My family kept their radio for 20 years.
Well, people do turn to listening to radio, but they listen to the radio on their digital devices.
Well, this is part of an overconsumption system, yes? It's not just this. We are consuming too much, and the resources are just not there. One statistic, if everybody in the world enjoyed the same average standard of life as the citizen of California, you would need 5 Earths. We only have one. So we cannot carry on consuming in this way.
So we have a real paradox. I mean, on the one hand, we want everybody's life to improve, and that, in today's world, will have to be done through the digital way, more or less. And the digital economy is becoming more and more important. On the other hand, we also have this environmental problem. Where is the way out?
Well, one is about how you measure a good society. At the moment, or a successful society, at the moment we measure it in terms of productivity, gross national product. But we could measure it in terms of quality of life. And if you measured it in terms of quality of life, then you have a different ranking of societies. Some poorer societies, people are much happier, they have a much better quality of life socially and personally. So that's one thing. Maybe we have to think about what we're aiming for, not just more and more productivity, but a quality of social life. The other thing is, for me, I grew up in Britain when we had a lot of state ownership of key facilities like the telephone network and so on. Mm-hmm. I think we have to go back to much stronger regulation of these facilities and much stronger public intervention. You need an internet, but who should control it and who should be accountable? I certainly don't think it should be Google and Facebook. So I think we have to, in a way, go back to that idea. There are certain key resources that support all of our lives that should be held in common. They should not be...
That's free, that's public, that's good for everybody.
Yes, and they should be regulated in the public interest, not just to make money.
Mm-hmm. Finally, how can we build a better communication system, meaning public opinion, in this regard to help regulate the climate change?
It's interesting that in recent months, scientists have begun to form themselves into an organization. They're so depressed by the bad coverage or the stupid coverage of scientific ideas, they're now going to be proactive and collaborate with journalists and so on. And as people who are primarily responsible for communication, myself in the university and you in a much bigger forum, we have a particular responsibility to make the evidence available to people, but also to explain the arguments. If we do not do it, no one will do it.
What do you think of the relevance of Karl Marx's work in today's world?
Well, I think he's become more relevant in recent years. The big event in the West was the 2008 financial crisis. And that really broke the idea that the economy was working. It clearly was not working. And Marx, of course, throughout his life, he emphasized that capitalism was not a smooth system. It would be subject to periodic crises. And so when the 2008 financial crisis happened, people said, oh, Marx was right. Things are not going to work. And I think that's reinvigorated people's interest in him. Before, particularly with the fall of the Soviet Union, people said, oh, well, you know, he's gone, he's finished, it's all finished now. But now he's a very contemporary figure. The other thing that's happened, of course, is that since that crisis, you've seen a huge increase in levels of inequality. You see that across the Western world. Mm-hmm. The difference between the rich and the poor is getting bigger and bigger every day. So in a way, we've gone backwards to a situation Marx would know very well from the 19th century. So the landscape of capitalism now, although you have high-speed train and computer, yes, the social landscape is very, very similar to the one he described.
That's really incredible. I mean, to think about that although we have developed so much ahead, what he was describing is still relevant, but was what he proposed can still answer the questions for today? Can his theory still provide answers for the question, the problem you just mentioned?
My own view is that his theories are a necessary starting point, but he died in 1883, so he couldn't answer all of the questions that we have.
What is the starting point, for instance?
Well, the starting point is that we still, in the West, we still live in a capitalist society. And I think his analysis of capitalism is still the most solid and the most convincing. So as long as we have a capitalist society, I think we need to start with his fundamental perceptions, which were firstly that it's a society of exploitation, that the rich will try to take everything they can and run away, and that it's a society that will always have crises and will manufacture inequalities. All of those characteristics are now very, very familiar to us in the current situation across Europe. It's a fundamental crisis of the whole system. So he's a man who understood crisis.
Let's talk about the situation in China. Is Marxism still the relevant theoretical framework to guide China's development in the future, or do you think new ideas need to be drawn in to reinforce that?
You certainly need some new ideas, but I think he still is relevant, because when you had a revolution, you didn't have a capitalist society. I mean, the revolution entered a society that was much less developed. Now you are creating your own form of capitalism, capitalism with Chinese characteristics.
Instead of socialism
well, I mean, it's also has socialism with Chinese characteristics, but I think you've moved now much more towards a capitalist system with markets and profit generation and so on. And as soon as you do that, then I think Marx becomes more relevant, because that's the society he analyzed. He was never an analyst of communism. You know, the Communist Manifesto was not a manifesto for a communist party. There was no communist party until after Marx died. It's a manifesto for a vision of a society that would have solidarity, would have common ownership of property, and where people would not exploit each other. That was what he wanted, that's what he dreamed of, but he never lived to see that. But what he did was to produce a very fundamental analysis of the society he saw all around him. So as long as you have any elements of capitalism in a society, Marx is absolutely relevant.
What do you think of the call nowadays, or the kind of urgent need expressed by the Chinese leadership to revisit Marxism? In
principle, of course, that's a good thing. So studying him carefully is a very important thing. But I think that you need to remember two things. Firstly, he never finished his work. The first volume of Capital is the only substantial book he ever published in his life. The other two volumes of Capital were compiled after he died from notes. And he had a plan for many more volumes. Originally, when he approached his publisher, he was going to publish something like 10 more volumes on all sorts of things, international trade, the role of the state, and so on. He never published any of them. And so we still have to fill in the gaps. And that's why the notebook, all through his life, he wrote notebooks. And many fundamental insights, but there may be 2 or 3 pages, and then he passes on to something else. So we have a lot of work to do to complete his work.
Let's talk about the kind of implication of his theory in the present day world and maybe in the world in the future. Right now, it's all characterized by the digital aspect of things, right? And we are seeing a huge increase of corporate giants in the digital media. For instance, in the United States, we have Google, we have Amazon, we have Facebook, Twitter, and in China, we also have very similar phenomena, for instance, Baidu and Tencent.
Yes.
What do you think is the impact of digital media on cultural diversity, and whether Marxism can provide some guidance in that respect?
The digital media are even more concentrated than the old media. I mean, 6 companies dominate Western media, film, TV, newspapers, and so on. And those are very familiar. Disney, News Corp, Viacom, and so on. When the internet came, remember, it was supposed to be an open system. And everybody believed, or most people believed, that it would break the power of these big corporations. You have these big corporations at the top, and they're sending material down to audiences. everybody believed the internet would be a flat system. Everybody would be able to participate. What came as a huge surprise to most people was that very soon power over the popular internet became so concentrated. So you now have virtual monopolies in the West over key areas of people's popular use. And they have incredible control over what you can see on the screen. You take Apple, for example. Apple will not allow anything onto an Apple machine that they have not approved. This is a new kind of censorship. This is a new kind of control. It's what I describe for my students. It's the censorship of money. And it's very, very powerful. So we now have a digital media system that is more and more concentrated than we've ever had before.
What is the benefit of that, and what is the challenges of that?
Well, the benefit is convenience. I mean, everybody says, oh, I can get everything on my phone. No, you can't get everything. The damage...
Only the things that are allowed to come to you.
Yes, it's a form of censorship. So the damage is what you never see. So take Facebook, for example, in Britain. Facebook now plays a major role in news items onto people's Facebook pages. From young people, it's the dominant source of their news. They're not watching programs like this. They're not reading the newspapers. They look on Facebook. What does Facebook put on there? It only puts the things that are relevant to that person as judged by their previous postings. So you only get to read things you already agree with. And this is a disaster because you never see other points of view. So you just get confirmed in your own views. That's an incredible closure of the mind, but also of debate.
Yeah, well, while he was compiling the Capital, Marx was talking about the role of machines in the accumulation process. What do you think of the role of machine is in this internet age in connection to what you just said?
We're moving into a whole new era which you can only just glimpse, which is built around particularly robots and artificial intelligence. We're moving into what's called the Internet of Things. So that people think of the internet, you and I send each other things. The Internet of Things is where you have intelligent devices, your refrigerator, everything in your house has a computer capacity, and they communicate with each other, but also without your knowledge.
Yes.
But they're sending all kinds of information about you, what you like to eat, what you've got in your fridge, and so on. So we've already moved into a situation where the machines are talking more than the people. And you have no control over that. Then when we come to robots, there's an estimation in the United States that in the next 15 years, robots will take 47% of all the current jobs that people do. Now, we have an enormous crisis. What are we going to do if that happens? How will people live?
And people are talking about the internet of everything, which is even a step even further. But drawing from your research background, do you think Marxism or Marx would have come up with some kind of starting point for an answer to this?
Well, Marx, in one of his notebooks, Marx has an interesting discussion of this, but it dramatizes the problem. He says, this could be wonderful because it would free people from doing very boring tasks and everybody could live a much fuller life if we were prepared to pay them not to work. But he also says, well, under current conditions, information and knowledge is owned by corporations. So it depends who gets the benefits of this intellectual knowledge that is inside the machine. Who will own the machine is really the big question.
Basically, not the people whose jobs have been replaced by the robots, but the corporations.
And that's a big problem.
Yes, that we are seeing, and people are trying to shift blames for that by finding all kinds of excuses. But that gets to a different topic. Let's talk a little bit about your research area, because you are known in the West or in China as a leader of the revitalization and development of critical political economy of media and communication. But there are many many scholars who tend to isolate cultural studies with a political economy. Why do you want to bring the two together?
Well, because that's the way the media are structured. The media are two things at the same time. They're clearly an enormous industrial system. Enormous numbers of people are working in them. They make a lot of money. They're capitalist corporations like other corporations. But they have this one distinction, which is what they make is not something that you can buy or touch. It's our cultural world. They make the stories, they make the news, they make the symbolic world, the images that we all use to try to understand ourselves and to understand the world. So for me, the really important question is, I'm very much in favour of having a cultural system which is diverse and dynamic. So you ask yourself, what kind of economic organisation of the media will help us to achieve that? Is it a good thing that only 6 companies control so much? The answer for me is no, it isn't, because that gives too much power to a very small number of people to decide what stories you will hear, what information you will receive. So for me, the two things cannot be separated. You have to think of the media as simultaneously both an economic system and a cultural system.
But from the trends you're seeing, from the statistics you're seeing, are we heading even further in that direction? Just more concentration of information and power in smaller corporations?
Yes, we are, and that's the paradox of the internet, because the internet could be a system of participation. It could be a system for allowing more people to participate. But it's being closed. It's being closed down by these corporations. And for most people, they're very happy just to have all of that on their phone. That's all they want.
Yes,
and,
unfortunately.
you know, so they are not demanding to be, participating, except to send selfie or something. So we have a major problem. I think we have a culture that is closing in on itself much before, actually.
And we in the media definitely have the primary responsibility to think what to do and how to do it differently.
Well, you also have the responsibility to offer something that people cannot just get from the big companies, something different.
That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow us on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.